down.
Welcome to Planet Lex, the podcast of Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, with your host, Dean Daniel B. Rodriguez, bringing it to you from Chicago, Illinois. Take it away, Dan.
Hello, and welcome to Northwestern Law's Planet Lex, podcasting from the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law in Chicago, Illinois. I'm your host, Dean Dan Rodriguez. My guest today is Bill Henderson. Bill is the Stephen F. Burns Chair on the Legal Profession at Indiana University Moore School of Law in Bloomington, and he is a visiting professor this fall at Northwestern Law School. Bill's research focuses on empirical analysis of the legal profession and legal education, and he is the editor and founder of Legal Evolution, an online publication focused on the changing legal industry. His academic work has appeared in a number of legal journals, and he regularly publishes in the American Lawyer, the ABA Journal, and the National Law Journal. Bill's work and thought leadership is frequently quoted in many outlets, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and National Public Radio, and he was included in the National Law Journal's list of 100 most influential lawyers in America. Bill is also the co-founder of Lawyer Metrics, an applied research company that helps lawyers and law firms use data to make better operational and strategic decisions. Lawyer Metrics was acquired by Lex Institute in 2015. Thanks for joining me today. Bill, I want to get right into your former company and your current company, as it were. Tell us a little bit more about your work in Lawyer Metrics, what that is about, and the evolution, as it were, of that company, and then a bit about Legal Evolution, among others, your current
Sure. First of all, Dan, thanks for having me here. It's a real pleasure, and I'm really impressed with the setup here. It's really world-class here. So Lawyer Metrics was basically an idea that I had in basically 2008, 2007. Remember when the legal market was going crazy and we couldn't produce enough law school graduates and pay them enough money?
Ah, the good old days.
The good old days. I went to my dean, and this is the famous bimodal distribution, or it became famous in my small circle of some graduates making $40,000 or $50,000 a year, and then nobody making much money between, just say, 70 and 150, and then a bunch of people making $160,000 a year.
Entry-level lawyers.
Entry-level lawyers.
Yeah.
And markets aren't supposed to clear that way. And so I went to my dean. I said, I know that the market for talent is broken. We're paying some people too much, some people too little. If we understand this market, we can help in the correction and maybe monetize it. And she liked that idea. It was vague. And so we got together a group of alumni, and we had this thing called the Human Asset Development Program. And that we eventually realized it was going to be too difficult to run this as a unit of the university. So alumni got together, and we put together a for-profit company funded by them and a few other folks, with the beneficial intent of someday if it got sold, it would benefit the law school. And so that company was incorporated in 2010, eventually took some alumni investments along the way. And it was originally focused on the talent market. So it was applying metrics to understand the legal talent market. Eventually, over time, as we realized that was a difficult market to be the first mover in, and there was a lot of interest in just metrics generally, we started building some very sophisticated data sets. We had some PhD statisticians in the company that were really brilliant. And so it became more about the data, and a subset of the business became about applications to talent management.
And this was intended to be used, and in fact was used by law firms.
Oh, yeah.
Mega firms, medium-sized firms, firms across the board.
Most of it would be firms that would be in the AmLaw 200 or the NLJ 250. Those were our principal clients. We did some work for legal departments. We did a fair amount of work for law schools, and we did some work for smaller firms. And learning to sell data to lawyers is a story unto itself. That was the real journey of that, realizing that we were at the very base of a mountain that was going to be climbed over the next generation.
And you climbed it, as it were, for a number of years and sold the company in 2015 to Lex Institute, which is, tell us a little bit about that.
Lex Institute, formerly called Access Group, was a little unit of the Law School Admissions Council in the 1980s. And the dilemma of the law school deans at the time is that the federal government wasn't providing enough money to meet the full cost of attendance. And so there needed to be a private market to originate loans to law students to meet the full cost of attendance. And so the Law School Admissions Council, originally it's a nonprofit that's focused on the admissions market, decided to take up that cause and create a lending unit. And eventually that spun off into Access Group in the early 1990s. And so Access Group basically was responsible for financing the the higher ed needs of probably 80% of the law school graduates from the 1990s and the 2000s. And one thing that's a kind of an interesting part of that story was people who went to law school have historically paid back all those loans. And so lending to law students has been a remarkably good business. Now, their core business of lending ended when the higher ed laws changed in 2010, where the federal government started originating all the loans. And so Access Group by that time had accumulated a lot of assets and now has repurposed itself into a data and education company. And so we were a strategic buy for them. But, they're going to do some good in the world by shifting away from law school lending into the data and education business.
And what was formerly Lawyer Metrics will help them with that.
Yes. It's called Lawyer Metrics with an X on the end now.
Good. So now Bill Henderson 2.0, with all the free time that was created by your selling of Lawyer Metrics, you moved into Legal Evolution. Talk to us about that.
So Legal Evolution was basically the biggest takeaway that I had from being involved in Lawyer Metrics because I'll be frank about this one. Selling data to lawyers was a very long sales cycle. Remains a long sales cycle, but the need, the principle is right, but the methodology, perfecting the methodology is difficult. And so I went and started to study diffusion theory. So listeners might want to be attuned to a book by Jeffrey Moore called Crossing the Chasm. It's the Bible in Silicon Valley for how startups turn into successful operating companies. And my friend Paul Lippy used to always talk about Jeffrey Moore. And so I picked up a copy and I saw this technology adoption life cycle and started researching and realized it was really the Rogers diffusion curve and that there was an entire field of empirical research done in universities to explain how innovative ideas actually get adopted. And that was the core of my business challenge at Lawyer Metrics. And so I learned diffusion theory to solve my practical problem of a long sales cycle. And I realized, well, that problem is everybody's problem that's trying to bring innovation into the legal space. And so the purpose of Legal Evolution is I picked up the problem of lagging legal productivity, which data is one of the methodologies that will be used to improve the ability for lawyers to take an hour of their time and solve more legal problems with that hour. And data process technology are some of the innovations that need to be brought online to achieve that goal. And so Legal Evolution presents the theory of diffusion theory, and then shows practical applications of it. And so it's an academic project, undeniably, but I think it's going to have I hope it'll have a big impact on the legal industry because it will show how to get this right.
What's the elevator speech about diffusion theory? Goes back to the early 60s, right? Everett Rogers.
Absolutely right here. Everett Rogers, the elevator speech here, I'll take a crack at that. Basically, all adoptions of innovations proceed through a social system. And, innovators and early adopters go first, and then people copy those innovations. And so the real key is focusing on innovators and early adopters so that they can be successful and then transmitting their success so the whole social system will adopt it. It's really sociology at its core focus.
So Rogers and his progeny, as it were studying innovation in a variety of industries. You're drilling down into law. How optimistic do you have to be? You have to be about lawyers and law firms and their receptiveness to these ideas in order to be optimistic about it making a difference.
I'll take the kind of the scientific approach here. I know what the end is going to be. I just am uncertain about the timing. And I feel like that the industry would benefit by accelerating the timing. I know that these methodologies that have been used in all these other contexts very successfully and that account for the wealth and prosperity of our country and our world will apply to the legal problems. But it's overcoming the kind of cultural and regulatory barriers that impede that. But, we just have to make it easier to do the right thing. That's really all this is about.
So, Bill, let me ask you this. What are the skills that a lawyer needs to prosper and thrive in 2017? And let me ask the follow-up at once, which is there any good reason to believe that the answer to that question would be different for a lawyer 20, 25 years from now?
I would say let's start with the skills here. I think you need a sophisticated understanding of law. Other disciplines would be very, very important, kind of combined together with law to see how society works. Communication skills are the mother of all skills, and part of the communication skills is the empathy, trying to see things from the listener's point of view, which is an undercultivated ability for all lawyers, even people with very high IQs. But I would think that the key thing here and continuing to learn here would be another touchstone. But actually the key is being able to collaborate with multiple professionals, which goes back to the communication, the listening skills, because we're entering into these higher order complex problems, and we're going to have to solve them with other disciplines besides pure law. And so it will only become even more so in 25 years from now. But I think that the 4 years of undergraduate plus 3 years of graduate training, I don't think that law is going to be made better by making the legal education shorter. But I do think that we can take some of that 3 years of legal education, practice the collaboration and communication so that we're more skilled as a professional when we go into the workplace. And I think that if we can deliver on that in our 3 years of legal education, people will be anxious to hire our grads.
Let me do a little bit of a lightning round with you in terms of the traditional contemporary practices in law firms and see whether or not this impedes innovation as you see it or helps facilitate it. The billable hour, the notion of lawyers billing their time in the traditional way, is that going to go the way of the dinosaur? Is that pretty much instantiated in our model? Is that helpful?
Wow, you've asked a really good question, and that question would take, there's a few layers to that particular onion. But one of the reasons why the billable hour is so entrenched is it's easy and it's culturally accepted. And it's accepted not only by the law firms that like it because they can quantify their risk, but the clients find it an accounting unit they can get their head around. And so it's the cultural compatibility and because of its simplicity that makes it so entrenched. And we're talking about an entire paradigm instead of cost plus moving to kind of like shifting the risk onto the provider. And that's a huge paradigm shift. And so the billable hour is an impediment, but you almost need a Manhattan Project to figure out a way to kind of get rid of it because it's so culturally compatible and so ensconced in people's minds. So it's an accounting system, it's a reward system, it's a pricing system, it's a lot of things.
So here's another one, partnership track, the tournament of associates, as it were, to yield partners and the leverage of partners and associates in the modern big law firm.
Well, it's really breaking down here. Mark Glanner gets the credit for this of coming up with the metaphor of tournament of lawyer. It's been questioned as being kind of theoretically accurate as a matter of kind of tournament theory in economics, but as a metaphor, it's a winning concept. What we're seeing is just a real diminution in the intake at the kind of the base of the pyramid of the associates, and there's just not a lot of room at the top because this model works wonderfully when the market is growing, but when the market is flat, you can't reward people by cutting them into the equity tier because that just dilutes the pie, and you have to reward top performers, and so that partnership model is slowly kind of collapsing onto itself. I don't know what's going to replace it, but it only works in times of growth. And so it leads to a lot of issues regarding talent pipeline and how we skill up people to do the highest level work. But I would say that the reason it's not a crisis is it affects all companies equally. And so it's not a source of competitive advantage. It's just a systemic industry headache right now.
Great. I got two more quick ones. One is the scrupulous attention to rankings, particularly in the am law world, and more specifically, the reliance on profits per partner as the sort of the paradigm of rankings of firms. Is that problematic? We'll talk about rankings in law schools later, but just talking about rankings of law firms.
I think that the idea of ranking just taps into human nature and kind of envy and how we compare ourselves to others. I just think that it's like, putting a plate of cookies in front of me, just like I'm not going to be able to resist. I think that a lot of people, it taps into our insecurity and our sense of comparativeness. And so it's known to be the winning strategy for publishers to put things into ordinal rankings, but it doesn't help. And I think you and I have thought quite a bit about this one. The way to beat the rankings is to come up with success where it's clearly a winning success, but it's not captured by the league tables. And so they have to build a new league table around your new model. Mm-hmm. And so you're going to lose if you compete within the ranking tables trying to climb up them. You want to be able to transcend it, figure out a new dimension that kind of makes the older rankings irrelevant. So it's really about thinking about a paradigm shift.
Right. And just to close the loop a little bit on the rankings, there are other industries and indeed other parts of the academy that haven't solved that problem, but more that. So business schools, for example, have a plethora of rankings that develop that. But law firms and law schools are under the boot heel, as it were, of respective organizations, AmLaw with law firms and U.S. News with law schools.
It may cut, in particular, vengeance with lawyers for a variety of reasons, but I think that the impact of rankings is most acute in this industry, although you can see evidence of it, throughout the academy and throughout the professions.
And the last one I want to ask about is talent management at the hiring level. You wrote an influential article several years ago with data to back it up that suggested actually that graduates of law schools that may not be in the tier of Northwestern and other schools have greater success, ceteris paribus, right, with respect to partnership. But that is juxtaposed with what law firms have traditionally been doing and continue to do, which is hiring from so-called elite law schools in the same way, in the same essential manner. How does that jibe with your approach to innovation?
The problem you just talked about was basically what gave rise to lawyer metrics. I mean, it was that fundamental paradox that we thought that was the basis for a potential labor arbitrage. And the empirics of that were, at least from my perspective as an empiricist, very interesting. But I'll kind of give you the high-level version of it. Is that everybody needs to be smart to be a successful lawyer, but to be successful at the highest levels, you need tremendous dedication and commitment and motivation. And a lot of the things that we were picking up on were proxies for basically how bad do you want it. And that said, there's the cultural aspect of wanting to be elite. And so I don't think that any firm has been able to take full advantage of basically what you really want. And there's about equal numbers of people who really want it at a school like Northwestern as there are at schools outside the top 10 or the top 14. But I've yet to see a law firm fully embrace the idea that you can find the best people, but you have to do it irrespective of where they went to law school. And the partners just can't get their heads around that.
Well, they're risk averse, right?
Yeah, they're risk averse.
Why give up the model that's made Cravath and others so successful for 100 years?
Yeah, and the interesting thing, I've written about this in a variety of different contexts, and I don't consider it my cause in life to try and correct this pattern, but I do highlight that the person who understood talent the best was Paul Cravath himself. And in the first 12 pages of the second volume of the firm's history, they lay out in 12 pages exactly what made that model so successful. And he talks about how his system of training was to make a better lawyer faster. And his recruiting method going to the national law schools was he wanted somebody with an undergraduate training. And so the national law schools were the only ones that had undergraduate training because you spend your life solving problems. Well, a little bit of history, a little bit of economics, a little bit of political theory is really helpful in making business analogies. And so that base general education, Paul Cravath highly valued. And also the scholars that were teaching at the national law schools were involved in the New Deal, were involved in the American Law Institute's restatement movement, the unified state law movement. And so they were just being taught by objectively better people. So that was an example of basically legal education at the national law schools being truly innovative and Paul Cravath having a supply problem and him getting the best entry-level raw talent and then having a training system to create world-class business lawyers. And so he got it right. And I'm always astonished that very sophisticated lawyers don't think in systems the way Paul Cravath did. He had it exactly right.
For the time and how law schools were configured and what they were doing, right? And so that's a good segue to talking a bit about legal education. So what are law schools doing right and what are law schools not doing right in terms of the training and education for this new professional world?
So, Dan, you had this, I'm going to turn the tables on you here a little bit because that question is a good question, but I think that a point you made recently, I think is the kind of the foundation point to have this conversation. Lee Jones at the National Law Journal wrote an article regarding, culling Richard Susskind's book, Tomorrow's Lawyers, on legal education aspects. And they asked a bunch of academics, including you, and it was across the board's responses or kind of varied responses. And you said, we do the best we can with the cultural and regulatory constraints we have. And I think that our ability to innovate is really affected by the kind of the cultural milieu of the academy and the regulatory constraints. And to a certain extent, we're buffered from the market because the market doesn't clear based upon how well we teach our students. And so there's a lot of limitations to what current legal education can do to solve its own problem. But that said, I have been impressed that legal education is actually coming up with a lot of great ideas, but it's coming up with these ideas 2 or 3 faculty members at a given school doing something really creative, not enough to kind of save their institution necessarily, but enough to show that they really care and that they're very creative individuals and creative teachers. And unfortunately, those little examples of micro innovation, when they're aggregated together, they tell a compelling story, but they're seldom aggregated together. And so the narrative on legal education is more pessimistic than it deserves to be. But those cultural and regulatory constraints, that's a huge problem. And I think that we're going to figure out how to make this transition, but it's going to take a generation, and it's going to be, well, we can talk about that more here. You have ideas on this.
Well, let me divide up that cultural and regulatory, because I think they both are features that are key. So on the culture part, let me make this as a declaration rather than a question.
Sure.
Maybe I'll put a question mark, as we do in faculty workshops. It's like, what do you think of that? Part of the cultural difficulty stems from the lack of rewards and incentives within the modern law school and structure of academia to truly innovate and to get rewarded in the ways in which we're rewarded for doing innovative things, teaching new kinds of courses, teaching existing courses in new ways. In your case, working, deeply on matters of the profession, which can be very lonely, not in interacting with other professionals, but interacting with colleagues in law schools, because not a lot of folks are working on that. So what do you think of that? Or I guess a bit more meaningful question is, do you think the structure of rewards and incentives are gonna change in ways?
Well, that's a really good question. A lot of times the first attempt is people say, we got to get rid of tenure. I couldn't do anything that I've done in terms of innovation without tenure. So I'm in the tenure camp, where I think the tenure can be used to take risks. I mean, I'm writing Legal Evolution, which means that I'm not publishing things in academic journals. Why do I do that? Because I can go to my dean, and I can go to the university, and I can just say with a straight face, I think that this is what the industry needs. I'm using my academic freedom to do this. And the same thing with creating new courses. And so,
well, let me interrupt on that. So in some sense, a metric for success would be if Indiana, Northwestern, other leading law schools actually start hiring the next generation of Bill Hendersons, right? Hiring folks and saying, a road to get tenure and a road to get fame in the legal academy is to do serious empirical work on the profession, or do work that's more accessible to a wider audience in that sense. And I couldn't agree with you more. That's not happening now. You're doing a lot of that on the other end of tenure. But if we really start hiring in a law school context to do that kind of work, then that might counteract some of the cultural phenomena.
I think that's really interesting that you say that, because I can remember when I put together my tenure file in 2008, and I had a section on it regarding, blog posts, and I had 216 blog posts, and I put it in my file with links to all of them. And my faculty mentor said, "Bill, you don't need that. It's not helpful." Because I know it doesn't matter, and I know I don't need it because I'm going to get tenure for other reasons, but it ought to matter. And I'm hoping that I can, and that was a little attempt to change the cultural norms here a little bit. I don't expect it to change just because the force of my idea. It'll take a generation, maybe longer, for it to change, but different ways of interacting with the profession. The blogosphere has been a wonderful thing to bring the academy and the profession closer together. We're actually engaged in a much richer dialogue than we were, say, 10 years ago. And so, that was my attempt to change these things. I'm being realistic. It's not going to change overnight. And actually, you don't need to hire Bill Henderson. You just need to let people develop. You have enough innovative people in your own here. We just let them kind of go their own way and do the right thing. I'm much more optimistic about the quality of people we're hiring. We have good people. We just need to give them a little bit more rope.
So let me shift to the regulatory part. So and again, sticking with law schools, although we can broaden it to talk about firms in a moment, but with law schools, we're sort of under the regulations and restrictions imposed by the American Bar Association, which credits law schools, AALS, which technically speaking is a membership organization, but casts a very wide shadow over what we do. And so there are various ways in which those regulations may impede innovation. Maybe one of the most basic ways, the structural model of law schools, which in the United States, unlike most other parts of the world, right, requires 3-year postgraduate education. The first year of the curriculum being highly fixed, and the advanced part of the curriculum being subject to some innovation, but still under the regulation and control to a great degree of organizations like the ABA and AALS. So that's a soapbox, but is that, how much are those regulations actually impeding the kind of innovation, diffusion of innovation that you've been studying?
I think that they lock in a model of how we do things, and I'm of the opinion that instead of trying to change those regulations so that we can, innovate or kind of act like businesses and innovate so we can capture more of the market, I don't think that that's the cultural mindset of the academy. I think that we're going to innovate outside of the regulatory framework, or kind of innovate so that we can kind of coexist with the regulatory framework. And so I think that we changed a bunch of rules here. I think that I'll give you just an example that's not meant to be critical in any way, but I think is illustrative. As soon as we kind of lock in, we kind of get this year's up and running, we list the courses and we get the teachers. If you're the associate dean here, this will be September or October of the fall. You're immediately kind of looking to replicate it for next year. There's no window to think about, well, if we're going to change things and change the curricula, this is like a steam engine. It kind of goes forward, and
there's no blue sky thinking with respect to the
you can't do
right?
it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very, very difficult so that we're immediately kind of populating next year's schedule as we get this year's class off the ground here, and there's just very little, as you said, room for blue sky thinking, and so I think you need to step outside and you need to create a pathway for law schools to make it easier for law schools to innovate or to kind of upgrade their skill sets.
So in some sense, you bring us back to culture. And if I'm not reading too much into what you're saying, we could talk and complain, as I have at different occasions, about the heavy hand regulation that's externally imposed. But it comes back to culture, which is another way of saying if the law schools really, really were meaningfully committed to change and to innovation, there's certainly room to do that. It's about good ideas and about will.
I think it's about good idea. I mean, I think it goes back to diffusion theory. Just to kind of tie the knot on the regulatory stuff here, the regulatory structure increases our cost structures dramatically. And so that, it would be good to change that. The cultural aspects of it, we need to kind of engineer around that particular feature. And I think it goes back to your point on rankings regarding kind of creating a new way that people can migrate to that's outside of the existing paradigm, but is not too difficult to begin to switch to. We need kind of a new winning strategy that people can easily join. And I think that that's what I'm interested in, creating a new winning strategy that others can easily join, where you don't take credit for the strategy.
Let me pivot back to law firms for a moment, and still sticking with this idea of regulation. There's a number of dimensions in which the regulation of practice may seriously impede innovation. So, I mean, you'll have your favorite checklist and I'll have mine. I suspect there'll be an overlap. The insistence that the work of lawyering be done by lawyers, licensed lawyers, trained and having a JD, and maybe this is a different regulatory structure. The balkanization of the legal profession, the diffusion of licensing across 50 states is certainly a big impediment. Another bullet point, the restrictions in the United States on alternative business models and the lack of the ability to have skin in the game, as it were, by outside companies, which is, we're becoming increasingly unique, right, in that respect. Those and other kinds of regulations, are they really, this is a leading question, I suppose, but they are impeding innovation in a way that stops real change from happening? Yeah,
you put your finger on, I think, a hugely complex and important issue. This inability to tap into outside investment. So we're talking about Model Rule 5.4, which is adopted in every jurisdiction or some variant of it, that keeps lawyers from co-venturing on an equity level with other professionals, is a huge impediment. Now, it's resolving itself to some extent for organizational clients like corporations, because we have the rise of these new law enterprises that they're taking on lawyer investment, and because
like Price Waterhouse.
And actually it opens the door for Price Waterhouse to get into the legal business. As long as they're selling to a corporation that has a general counsel, they can probably get around with it, like kind of lawyer to lawyer businesses. But in the individual people sphere, this is where it's hugely problematic. And we've got a kind of a 50-state balkanization and this idea of separation of powers that raises the question, can Congress even enact a law that federalizes the bar so that we can liberalize it and maybe preempt Rule 5.4? That's a difficult problem or difficult legal issue that I don't see anybody seriously considering. So I think that we're going to have to figure out a way to kind of engineer our way around those constraints. The one, I am hopeful that we'll have a Delaware effect in one jurisdiction that will embrace lawyer liberalization, primarily to solve the people law problem. I mean, I'll give you just an example here that I think is fascinating. You look at Kaiser Permanente's, the way they handle healthcare in, say, California, they divide it into three different groups. There's the hospital, there's the insurance program, then there's the group of doctors. I think two of the three of them are nonprofits. I think the doctors are in for a profit, but the idea is that they take the people in on a capitated basis, and they're very interested in keeping everybody healthy to make the system work. And actually, that system has worked really, really well for the people that are the Kaiser system. Not perfect, but it keeps the cost under control, and the doctors seem to like working in that system, and it's fairly transparent. I remember the folks at LegalZoom saying to me once, we aspire to be the Kaiser Permanente of legal services. And they made a very compelling case to me. They just said, look at how a lawyer's day is fragmented, having to do billing, having to do computer configuration, having to worry about marketing and things like that. Where in a hospital, you should have somebody who's practicing at the top of their license, solving a problem 8 hours a day, and you can rationalize it through the expertise and capital of other allied professionals. And I think that some state is going to just open the door and just say, we're going to liberalize it just for the benefit of providing access to legal problem solving at a cheaper level to our citizenry. I think that's going to happen.
And there's another element, too, in that Kaiser model, which is it becomes, just as Kaiser in the medical model, it becomes an employee benefit. Right.
Yes.
So in that sense, it addresses significant access to justice problems,
Yes.
certainly in the middle class and the lower middle class, by providing legal services as an employee benefit.
Yes,
right?
Because we know that we're going to pass away and we're going to bequeath our assets. We know we have a pretty good chance of getting into a personal injury situation. Half of us are going to get divorced. We're going to have child custody issues.
You're just the bearer of good tidings
Well,
today,
but
Bill.
it's the actuarial in me that says that's going to happen. And I see so many people as the pressure builds for innovation to get more creative. And so I'm actually optimistic. I think that when lawyers get together, I still think they're kind of, and this will be controversial, I think they're kind of a cut above, a lot of other groups of people in terms of their kind of intellect and their ability to kind of solve problems for the long term. The key issue is getting them to focus on the biggest picture possible. And I think that some creative lawyers are going to be responsible for really upgrading the contributions of the legal profession to our society. It's going to happen in a generation.
Let me ask you about, among others, one important practical venture that you've been significantly involved in, and that is developing a program for legal operations, different emerging professional role in law firms. Could you tell us a little bit about legal ops, as the phrase du jour goes, and also about this initiative that you're working on?
Yeah. So legal operations, it's typically thought about as a role within a legal department, and it gets around, it's probably coming into rise here to get around the billable hour issue. Say if you're a large corporation, you're doing work around the world, and you've got complicated products and different business units, your world of legal complexity, that tide comes in greater every year, overrunning the kind of the population. So you need to kind of get a handle on it. It's not so much that it presents itself like I don't have enough budget to cover my legal problems. It presents itself as a cost problem, but it really is a productivity problem. I need a systematic way to kind of reel in all this legal complexity and keep it within a fixed budget. And that's led to the rise of the legal operations movement, best exemplified by the Corporate Legal Operations Consortium, which are really kind of some practical, focused people. About half of them are lawyers, half of them are other professionals that are tasked inside legal departments of stretching their legal dollar so that they stay within the compliance of the law and they manage legal risk. And it's led to some very sophisticated thinking within legal departments. So the kind of the state of the art of law, to a large extent, is taking place inside a really big corporation legal departments as opposed to law firms, primarily because the incentive is different, because they have to optimize to stay within budget. And in a law firm, the name of the game is meeting your, this year's revenue target. And so the former is better for innovation than the latter. But legal operations, I just want to add this one point. Legal operations is a role that exists in law firms. And my friend David Cambria made this point. He's the head of global legal operations at ADM. He said, the best people in the law firms that do pricing and project management do exactly what I do, except they do it inside a law firm. And so the legal operations is a field to kind of grapple with legal complexity and build systems, but it's not exclusively in the legal department.
It's not been a field, though, that's garnered much attention on the part of law schools in terms of training and education models, right? So could you talk a little bit about how you're working to change that?
So I was involved in this creation of this thing called the Tech Lawyer Accelerator about 4 years ago. And the basic idea was, and this goes back to the labor market issue that we were talking about earlier, that if we could train people with just the basic data process technology, kind of give them a high-level view, a little bit of dirt under the fingernails, practical training over, say, a 3 or 4 week boot camp period, and then we paired them with an employer, typically inside a legal department or a small company working with the salespeople or the president, or inside a law firm, that there would be we would create a demand for this practical training. And so we ran that thing as we're now in our 5th year. It's mostly run in Colorado by a guy named Bill Moose, who created it. I helped get him some funding, so they let some of my students in. But we've had very good luck with it. And one of the people involved in it was Steve Harmon at Cisco. And Steve has been looking at the TLA as a source for labor in his legal operations department. Actually, he wants lawyers to come out of it in addition to legal ops folks. And Steve kept on harping with us, when can you expand this program? Well, we need to hire more people. So Bill Moose and I said, let's see if we can actually scale this. And so in the last 5 or 6 months, I've spent a huge amount of my time thinking about creating, well, we call it the College of Legal Operations, but it's actually more than that, because we're trying to create operationally aware lawyers. They're not just legal ops folks, but basically lawyers that respect data, process technology, aren't afraid of it, have some facility with it, and are better at collaborating. And so we're trying to get this off the ground here, getting a few schools to collaborate and pulling expert instructors from the field. And that's the kind of like the strategy I was alluding to earlier, kind of elliptically. I really think that if we get this College of Legal Operations off the ground, or whatever it ends up being called, and we allow schools to tap into this expanded program and their graduates are getting jobs, we've primed the pump for the labor market, and this is a winning strategy that's easy to join.
Great. Let me ask you, this is a little bit of an infomercial question, but I'll do it anyway. You've been teaching this course here, just concluded teaching a course here at Northwestern this fall on legal evolution. Can you talk a little bit about the course you've just taught?
Yeah, so the course is called How Innovation Diffuses in the Legal Industry. And I am doing applied research with my Legal Evolution blog. Applied research is kind of like, it's done in public health or rural sociology, or it's basically, figuring out how to make, more yield on your land in agriculture, or how to reduce disease. The idea is to come up with methodologies to improve legal productivity. So I'm really trying to solve a practical problem. And so diffusion theory is a great example of applied theory, because the idea would be how to get a social system of adopted beneficial change that will improve the quality of life within the social system. And so a lot of these innovations, if they're adopted by the legal social system, will solve a lot of important problems. And so the way it works is that you have to have an introduction to the actual theory, and then you need lots and lots of practical examples, with the idea that you can curate the examples and kind of reflect them to the social system and make it easier to adopt. And so this course lasted 8 weeks. We had 1 week of theory and then 6 weeks of guest lectures, and I've been chronicling them on legal evolution, with the idea of pulling the examples and then using the examples to make it available to the legal ecosystem. But this class was a combination of MSL students at Northwestern, mostly STEM students, and then JD. So they were mixed roughly 50-50. And it led to a tremendous amount of creativity, because one of the key things about diffusion theory is you need multiple perspectives. And this class met that challenge. And so the last class ended up on Wednesday. And I invited a bunch of outsiders, anybody who wanted to come really, and they had a great time seeing my MSL and JD students talk about diffusion theory, and then kind of, reinforce it with lots and lots of examples from the real world.
Well, I was there and I enjoyed watching it, and
it was a blast.
If and when you do it again, let me make an open offer to the listeners. Maybe we'll get a big crowd now.
Yeah,
come and watch the capstone.
The students are the talent. That's the way it should be.
Absolutely. Well, we covered a lot of terrain. We could cover a lot more. You don't have a movie to plug, but you do have a blog to plug. So Legal Evolution. Strongly encourage you to check it out. It's enormously interesting content. Academic research in the best possible way in study of the profession. So thanks, Bill, for joining us. That's our show for today. Thank you for listening. I'm Dan Rodriguez, signing off from the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law.
If you'd like more information about today's show, please visit law.northwestern.edu/planetlex or legaltalknetwork.com. Subscribe via iTunes and RSS. Find both Northwestern Pritzker School of Law and Legal Talk Network on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Or download the free app from Legal Talk Network in Google Play and iTunes. The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by, Northwestern University, Legal Talk Network, or their respective officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer.